Imagine walking into a general store in 1842 to supply your entire farm for the winter, taking home barrels of flour, iron nails, and thick wool, yet you never carry a single coin or paper note in your pocket. You pay with a promise, a tally mark and a heavy leather-bound ledger recording that you will bring in part of your spring wheat harvest or chop a cord of wood for the store owner when the freeze sets in. This wasn't some primitive stopgap for dirt-poor settlers trying to survive the frontier. It was a highly sophisticated, deeply personal economic engine that built early America almost entirely without institutional banks. Everything changed when a deliberate legislative hammer smashed this community-bound system to pieces in 1863, replacing it with a centralized debt machine, and the official history books quietly swept the old ways under the rug. You look at the grand brick buildings and sturdy oak furniture surviving from the early 19th century and wonder why things made today fall apart in a few years. But the answer isn't about better materials. It goes back to how human labor was valued before the National Banking Act forced everyone to buy into federal debt. People living in the American colonies and the early republic operated in a reality where hard currency, actual gold and silver coins known as specie, was incredibly scarce. A farmer in rural Pennsylvania or a blacksmith in upstate New York might go an entire year without touching a physical dollar. They didn't need to. The economy ran on book credit and mutual obligation. You knew your neighbors, you knew their skills, and your reputation was your credit score. If you needed a barn built, you didn't go to a loan officer to beg for a 30-year mortgage at high interest. You gathered the local carpenters, who operated under a strict guild-like system of unit pricing. These master builders had established rulebooks dictating the exact fair value of every single task, from laying a foundation to framing a roof. They didn't charge what the market would bear, and they didn't try to squeeze every last penny out of a desperate client. They charged the community standard. You paid them not in cash, but in bushels of grain, sides of beef, or by offering your own labor in return over the next several seasons. The debt was held face to face. It bound the town together because everyone owed something to someone else, creating a tight web of mutual reliance where letting a neighbor fail meant you might not get paid yourself. This system terrifies modern economists because it lacks centralized control and extracts zero profit for financial middlemen. A transaction between a shoemaker and a baker generated no interest for a banker in New York or London. Men like Thomas Jefferson recognized the power of these self-regulating artisan communities. Jefferson himself famously struggled to access the secret pricing rulebooks of the Carpenters Company of Philadelphia, because those records were heavily guarded proof that working men could manage large-scale construction economies without outside financial interference. These craftsmen designed and built structures like Independence Hall using math and pricing agreements passed down through apprenticeships, bypassing the need for corporate contractors or bank loans. They created things meant to last forever because their name and local standing were permanently attached to the physical object. If a chair broke or a roof collapsed, the maker couldn't hide behind a limited liability corporation. He had to look his neighbors in the eye at church on Sunday. This intense local accountability produced a standard of craftsmanship we can barely comprehend today. Then came the chaos of paper money, a slow poison introduced by state-chartered institutions that eventually gave the federal government the perfect excuse to kill the old system entirely. Long before Lincoln signed the National Banking Act, the United States suffered through the era of wildcat banking. Anybody with a printing press and a state charter could open a bank and issue their own paper money. By the 1850s, there were thousands of different paper notes floating around the country. A $10 bill issued by a bank in Ohio might be worth exactly $10 in Cincinnati. But the moment you crossed the state line into Pennsylvania, merchants would look at it with deep suspicion and only give you $6 for it. Counterfeiting was rampant. Shopkeepers had to keep thick, constantly updated reference books just to figure out if the brightly colored piece of paper a customer handed them was real, fake, or issued by a bank that had gone bankrupt 3 weeks ago. It was an absolute mess, but it was a decentralized mess. Local communities still mostly relied on their barter and ledger systems, treating paper money as a risky gamble used mostly by land speculators and long-distance merchants. The turning point wasn't a sudden desire for economic efficiency. It was the brutal reality of the Civil War. Wars cost an unimaginable amount of resources, and by 1863, the Union was bleeding cash it didn't have. The federal government needed people to buy its debt to fund the armies. But ordinary citizens had no interest in handing over their real wealth for government bonds. So, The politicians engineered a forced market. The National Banking Act of 1863 didn't just clean up the wildcat banks, it weaponized the money supply. It required the newly chartered national banks to buy federal treasury bonds. In exchange, these banks could issue official national currency. Suddenly, the entire foundation of the American economy was tied directly to federal debt. They slapped a massive tax on the old state banknotes, effectively wiping them out of existence overnight. You couldn't just trade goods and keep local ledgers anymore if you wanted to participate in the expanding industrial economy. The government demanded taxes in the new currency, forcing farmers and artisans out of their self-sustaining barter networks and into the wage economy. To truly understand the trap, you have to look at how this financial reset worked, alongside the supposedly generous Homestead Act. Signed into law roughly 9 months before the banking takeover, the government offered 160 acres of western land for a tiny filing fee. It sounded like the ultimate American dream, giving free dirt to anyone willing to work it. The ugly reality was that turning raw wilderness into a functioning farm required plows, seed, draft animals, lumber, and fencing. It cost thousands of dollars, money that ordinary laborers absolutely did not have. Where were they supposed to get it? The new national banks. The system offered free land as the bait and used the new centralized banking system as the hook. Small farmers took out heavy loans to buy equipment from massive eastern factories, betting their new land as collateral. When crop prices dropped or bad weather hit, the banks foreclosed. The land ended up in the hands of wealthy speculators, railroad tycoons, and mining companies. The independent master builder and the self-sufficient farmer were being systematically replaced by the wage laborer and the permanent debtor. With the local networks crushed and the money supply tightly controlled by federal charters, a new and darker American reality took root: the company town. This was the ultimate realization of what happens when you strip away a community's ability to trade freely among themselves. Deep in the coal valleys of West Virginia, or the textile mills of Massachusetts, massive corporations built entire towns where they owned the houses, the roads, the schools, and the stores. They didn't pay their workers in the new national currency. They paid them in company script, private tokens that were absolutely worthless anywhere except the company-owned store. Because the company faced zero competition, they jacked up the prices of basic groceries and rent. A miner would work back-breaking shifts underground all week, only to find his paycheck didn't even cover his family's food and housing costs. He instantly went into debt to the very company he worked for. It was a flawless trap. You couldn't quit and move away because you owed the boss money, and walking away from that debt meant risking prison or violence from company thugs. This corporate feudalism replaced the old face-to-face ledger system. In the past, owing your neighbor a few bushels of wheat meant you helped him fix his roof next spring. Owing the company store meant you were effectively an indentured servant. The great labor strikes of the late 19th century, like the massive Pullman strike that paralyzed the nation's railroads, weren't just about demanding a few extra cents an hour. They were violent, desperate screams from a population that realized their economic independence had been stolen. We look back at the 1870s and see a massive shift in how human beings were tracked. The 1870 census started documenting everyone as individual economic units. Genealogists constantly hit a brick wall right around this era because before the Civil War, your identity was tied to your local parish, your guild, your town. Afterward, you were a number on a federal roll, a worker, a taxpayer, a borrower. The mysterious destruction of the 1890 census records just before the National Archives were built feels less like an accident and more like the symbolic burning of whatever old connections remained. The only people who successfully fought off this forced assimilation were the Amish. They looked at the new world of commercial insurance, federal debt, and bank loans, and flatly refused to participate. They maintained their mutual aid networks, raising barns by hand and passing the hat in church to cover medical emergencies without extracting interest from each other. They had to drag the federal government to court to win exemptions from programs like Social Security, proving that the old system wasn't just viable, it was resilient enough to survive an industrial revolution if it was simply left alone. We have accepted a world where things break fast, where debt is normal, and where we rent our lives from financial institutions. But the surviving 18th century buildings and the solid antique chairs sitting in our living rooms are quiet, physical evidence that a fairer localized system actually existed. I really want to know what you guys think about this shift from local trust to bank control. Drop a comment below and tell me if you have any old family stories about surviving outside the modern banking system, or what piece of hidden history we should tear open next. Hit the subscribe button to join our community of history outsiders. We're building something solid here. No bank loans required. Just good stories and real truth. Let's keep digging.